would you do that?
To be safe.
Okay, and to do what?
To have your rights protected.
To protect your rights too.
Life, liberty, and property.
Yes. And the founders, of course, were heavily influenced by Locke. Locke was probably the second influence after Montesquieu. But of course they changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Yes. I'm never exactly sure how we pursue our happiness, but yeah. Okay. All right. So that was the first, sometimes called the first generations or the origins of the Enlightenment. Now, even then, folks, they were divided. There were people like Pierre Bayle, who wrote the Historical and Critical Dictionary. Yeah, maybe, Laurie, some year we'll use that, because that's kind of fun. Okay, now, he was writing about the same time as Locke. And he also addressed the issue of toleration. Toleration is also one of those broad themes in the Enlightenment along with education. Now, in Pierre Bayle, he was a Protestant, so he wasn't tolerated in France. He fled to the Netherlands, and he wrote this very popular book. It was said that it was in more libraries than any other in France, the Historical and Critical Dictionary. And it got by the censors because where was the good stuff? The incendiary stuff that most people never do when they read a book.
The footnotes.
Exactly, yes. And the censors, they have all these books to read, and so they looked at his and they thought, this is kind of harmless. They never read the footnotes, folks, and that was the incendiary part. Yes. Yes. But Pierre Bayle, in the beginning, he didn't tolerate atheists. But over time, his thinking changed. And he said, many atheists, and he went back in time, were better people than people who allegedly believed in God. So even there, he disagreed. I'm bringing him up not to confuse you, but just to show you the wide variety of opinion, even in the early Enlightenment. But in the beginning, Locke was seen as quite radical, saying that the state should not regulate religion. Because in the 17th and 18th century, folks, they oftentimes didn't differentiate. They saw it as part of the same body. If you were a political dissident, if you were a religious dissident, they saw it as a political threat. So it was not just solely a religious threat. So these men, we call them the philosophes, and we've talked about them. And so we want to get to the second generation. And oftentimes in textbooks and so forth, they only talk about the big trio: Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. And we got to watch the time here, because I have to keep in mind we don't have 8 weeks, we only have 1. Right. So Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. All right, so tell me, all right, we talked about this, that Montesquieu and Voltaire were both French, although Voltaire spent most of his life in Switzerland in exile, and Rousseau was Swiss and spent most of his life in exile in France. All right, so we have that. Okay, so what class were they from? Montesquieu. Yes.
Higher class?
What?
Were they from like a higher class?
Yes, which class was that? He was a noble. Yes. He was a noble. He was a judge in the Parlements, P-A-R-L-E, parle meaning to France, the law courts of France. And so that's why he wrote on the spirit of the laws. He wrote a whole bunch of other things as well, but most people know him just for that and for a famous novel he wrote, which we'll come to. All right, so what about Voltaire? His mother was noble and his father was a commoner. So, by definition then, according to French law, he was a commoner, because you get your birth status from your father, not your mother. Yes. And he was constantly attacking the nobles and those of the upper classes, and of course landing in the Bastille or in exile. Yeah. And then, what about Rousseau? Was he wealthy? Had many mistresses? Did well, or what class was he?
Wasn't he a
Yeah, he was a scholar. Scholars, that doesn't mean you're wealthy, though.
He would have been from the wealthy class.
He was from the lower classes. He was very poor. He had a miserable childhood. He was apprenticed out and hated it. Yes. He was quite a dissident even then. Yes. And he became more paranoid as he got older. I'll read you some excerpts from his letters and his journals, and you'll see. Yes. Yes. Voltaire greatly admired Montesquieu. And Montesquieu was the main influence on the founding fathers of the United States. If you take a look at the libraries of those who signed the Declaration of Independence and so forth, and the studies of libraries is rather indicative of what people read at the time. These books were, folks, extraordinarily expensive. And Voltaire praised Montesquieu. He liked Montesquieu. As I say, most of his philosophes he had no regard for at all. He is the author that always thinks and causes others to think. Think about what high praise that is. He causes you to think. I mean, what books do you enjoy reading over? I'm not talking about thrillers, because I like those too, but I mean, once you've read those, you kind of pass it, because you know what the, I hate to use the word trigger points are. Yeah. Never mind. Okay, but you guys are kind of awake today. All right, so, but my point is, an intellectual book is if it causes you to think of things in a new way, or it causes you to think differently, now that's a classic. Like Tocqueville maybe, or Burke, causes you to think about things in a new way. So Voltaire was greatly praising Montesquieu. He always thinks. He causes other to think. And Burke said, he was the greatest genius which has enlightened our age. And there's Montesquieu, again a flattering portrait. He was a lawyer, folks. He was immersed in the law. And Tocqueville said of him, Tocqueville, generally speaking, did not have a high opinion of the philosophes, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Revolution. But he said of him, he was the greatest genius of an enlightened century. Okay, so if we see the nation, the next slide. Montesquieu's one of his sole criterions was justice and liberty. That's how he said you should judge things. And he said, a nation may lose its liberties in a day and not miss them in a century. A nation may lose his liberties in a day and not miss them in a century. And kind of contrast Montesquieu with Rousseau, because Montesquieu talked about reason and science, and Rousseau was really much more of a polemicist. Okay. So, what was Montesquieu's approach to law? Okay? Other than human reason and justice and liberty. Liberty and reason, those were the true criteria for him of law. But how else did he approach it? That's kind of a general question. I mean, okay, spirit of the laws. What was the spirit of the laws? What influenced the laws? Does he say? I mean, we talked about justice and liberty as criterions. But what influences the law? What causes the law to develop as it does, guys?
It's the duties that citizens have to their government and vice versa.
Okay, it's duties of man to the government, yes. How about the size of the country, he said, influences it. The customs of the country influence. It's a very genetic approach. Customs, law, religion, that all influences it. That's why he says that, say, some savages in the New World they advocate that you should eat others. That's not really a Western European idea, is it? But he's explaining why certain people thought the way they did. He says, because the world can't be reduced to just one idea, yeah.
What? Maybe I should know this, but I don't. What do you mean when you say polemicist?
Somebody who engaged in polemical writing as opposed to reasoned analysis.
Is there a T in there? Is it like T?
Polemicist, Polemicist. E-C-I-S-T, polemicist, yes. He engages in polemics, but somebody who engages in polemics is a polemicist. So, yes, I think it must be my Ohio accent.
No, I think I simply didn't know that.
Okay, well, that's a lovely new word, isn't it?
Yes,
Yes, yes.
thank you.
But Montesquieu is often cited because he said power should always be a check on power. That's the basic idea of our government, isn't it? Executive, legislative, and judicial. Of course, it doesn't always work as well as we'd like it to, but that was his idea. Law in general, he said, is human reason. So insofar as it rules all the people of the earth. Okay. And the law was the great thing because he said the law made people equal. And that, of course, is the fundamental idea of our Constitution, isn't it? We are all equal under the law. But he talked about the environment, folks. Climate, like the North, people in northern republics, they were more moral and virtuous. In the South, okay, they tended to have more extreme governments. They were indolent and immoral and passionate. Okay? Small, cold places tended to be republics, like the Netherlands. And those hot, big places like China or the Turkish lands, those tend to be despotic. And in France, where he lived, it was a monarchy. It was middle-sized, it was mixed government. But he also said that power should always check power. So that's why he came up with the corporate thesis. Okay, what's a corporate body in the 18th century? Does anybody know? Of course, I know we haven't taken my 18th century class yet, but a corporate body is any body that has rights and privileges. Universities were corporate bodies, so students had certain rights and privileges, okay? Guilds, people in guilds, that was a corporate body. They had certain rights and privileges. Everybody in France belonged to a corporate body, okay? We professors, we belong to a corporate body. We're probably the most powerless in society, but yeah. We belong to a corporate body, so do you guys, the university. Montesquieu was a lawyer, so he belonged to the Parlements. That was a corporate body. He was also a member of the nobility. He belonged to that. People who were in the church, whether they were nobles or bishops or just little abbots, they belonged to a corporate body. Everybody in society belonged to a corporate body. Okay. Now, he had the ideas, it was often called the corporate thesis. Because, all right, so we're all part of this big society, and we each belong to these corporate bodies. He said the corporate bodies check the power of the king. Okay? And in particular, he said, it was the nobles who checked the power of the king. They prevent the king from becoming a despot. And of course, the most important body of nobles for at least Montesquieu were the nobles who were in the Parlements, the law courts. Because the law courts registered the edicts of the king. You see. So this corporate thesis, they checked the power of the king. They ensured the liberty of the people. Now, how many of you read his famous novel, The Persian Letters? Okay. All right, Professor Johnson and I have read it. Go on from there. All right, so I will tell you, this is a famous novel, and it's allegedly a travelogue. And again, this is a clever way to get around the censors. Because they thought, oh, this is just another travel literature, because, you know, travel in the 18th century was a miserable affair. I mean, the roads were awful, the inns were terrible, bed bugs, lice, terrible food. When you think traveling in the United States today is bad by air, well, try traveling in the 18th century, okay? You know, and the carriage would break down, you'd get stuck in the middle of nowhere in a rainstorm or hailstorm or whatever. But anyway, it was miserable. They didn't have paved roads, they didn't have airplanes, I mean, they didn't have much travel. You went by horse or carriage or whatever. Try going to a carriage museum and sitting in one of those carriages and see how that feels after 8 or 10 hours. Okay, so my point is people didn't travel much. This was an expensive luxury. Only the very wealthy could travel. And it wasn't much very enjoyable. So they liked travel logs. They loved the Jesuit letters telling them about China or Japan. Because they weren't going to go to China or Japan. But they liked hearing about all these exotic places. So travel letters were extremely popular. It was one of the most popular forms of literature. Okay? If a library had anything, okay, they had Newton. Yeah, and they may have had Bayle because they were reading those footnotes. And of course, they had travel logs. And books were extraordinarily expensive, but they liked reading about all these exotic places with these strange customs. And even the most well-informed folks really didn't have a good idea about what China and Asia and Japan was like. Go to the Oriental tea house that Frederick II built at his palace at Sanssouci, and what he thought Oriental folks looked like, and you'll see exactly what I mean. But my point is, they wanted to read about these exotic places, and so Montesquieu wrote this novel, The Persian Letters. And it's ostensibly about two Persians traveling throughout Europe, okay? And they're writing home about all the strange things they see. All right. And what he was doing was using these Persian letters to mock society and to mock the rulers at the time. You see, because it just bypassed the censors, they read a few pages. Oh, it's these Persians writing home and so forth. It seemed harmless, didn't it? Yeah, all right. All right, but here he is talking about Louis XIV. Of course, he's not talking about Louis XIV. These two Persian travelers are. All right. He likes to reward those who serve him, yet he pays even more liberally for constant attendance, or rather, the idleness of his courtiers as for the hard-fought campaigns of his captains. Often he shows preferment to the man who undresses him, or who hands him his napkin when he sits down to table, over some fellow who takes cities and wins battles. He does not feel that sovereign grandeur should be bothered with the doling out of favors, and without ever inquiring whether the man he showers with wealth is deserving. He believes that his choosing him will make him so. Thus he is known to give a small pension to a man who has fled battle, and a handsome governorship to a man who has fled for. Okay, so there he is. And it's kind of funny, guys. I'll read you what he says about marriage. Yes.
Now, 1 minute, just to let you know.
Oh, I only have 1 minute left.
Yeah.
Good Lord. We've run out of time, and we didn't get to Voltaire. All right. 1 minute left. I'll read you this quote, folks, guys, and we're going to start. I'm sorry, we got too carried away with the Enlightenment, darn it, but we'll move rapidly on Thursday. We'll have to. I'll bring in a watch or a clock or something because I wasn't watching the time. All right, we got 1 minute left. Here he is. He's talking about the first hour of marriage. In European nation, the first hour of marriage takes care of all difficulties. The bestowal of final favors can be dated from the nuptial blessing. And he goes on, Frenchmen never speak about their wives. That's because they're afraid to speak of them in the presence of people who know them better than they. Yes. And but you can read this letter. This is letter 45, folks. And he goes on and he talks about marriage. A husband who loves his wife is a man who lacks the attraction to make himself loved by another.